What are the most important qualities of a livable city? Well, look, while there's a lot of factors that are important, infrastructure, including social infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, would be amongst the top factors. Sure, there's so much to be grateful for about living in Australia, but that doesn't mean we can be complacent, because as our population grows, and it surely will, this is going to place increasing demand on infrastructure, and maybe we're just not going to be able to keep up. Now, of course, there's much more to infrastructure than just being stuck in traffic or wedged in overcrowded public transport when you're trying to get somewhere, according to Ross Elliot, my guest today. So whether you're a property investor wanting to understand how future development and infrastructure is going to influence demand on housing, or maybe you're a business owner needing to understand what's ahead, I'm sure at the end of today's show you'll have more clarity from the insights Ross Elliot's going to share. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
What will Australia look like mid-century? Our governments have got a business plan and they want to see our population rise to around 38 million people by 2054. Now, it's taken us over 200 years to reach a population of 25.5 million people. And now we're going to see us somehow or other squeeze an extra 12 million people into Australia. And most of these, around 7 million, are likely to come from overseas. Now, when we look at this in context, in the last couple of years, our pandemic halted population growth. It just became a mere blip. But now a large number of new people are coming to our country. We're going to significantly need to get more infrastructure, more roads, more schools, more utilities, more social infrastructure. Are we even going to be able to provide these? In fact, are we providing them adequately at the moment? There's some of the topics I'd like to discuss with today's guest, Ross Elliot, because the answer to these questions are going to be really important for those interested in property and for business owners in general. Now, Ross has spent close to 30 years in the real estate industry in various property roles, including as a state executive and chief operating officer of the Property Council of Australia, a national executive director of Residential Development Council. Boy, he's got a long list of current roles too, as the chair of the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, chair of the Urban Land Institute, Brisbane City Council, director of Suburban Alliance. Boy, you've got a lot more there, Ross. I won't go through them all other than to say welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That's quite the introduction.
Well, you've also been providing blogs on your site, which I'm going to give a link to, and on Property Update for a number of years. Now, Ross, you and I are old enough to remember those old computer games. Remember many years ago, there was one called SimCity, I think, that allowed players to build civilizations from the ground up. As a player, you could build roads, water supplies, industrial precincts as your city grew, and this would then attract workers who'd then pay taxes and allow you to continue building the civilization. And I think in the end, you ended up getting armies and conquering the world. I never got to that level. However, if you failed to provide adequate infrastructure, your community, the sentiment would sour, residents would leave, they'd go live elsewhere, civilizations would collapse. And as a player, the game would be over. That's sort of the stage I got to, Ross. So to a degree, that's really what seems to happen in the real world. So has Australia adequately provided infrastructure for the significant population growth that we've experienced over the last couple of decades?
It is a great question. Some people would say that we've never provided infrastructure to match population growth for 200 and something years. We've been playing catch up ever since white man arrived. The thing that's really happened in the last 20 years or more is that our rates of growth, the speed at which we're growing, has clearly outstripped our ability to match the required infrastructure. And I'll just put this into a little bit of context for you. In Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, the populations of those metro areas were forecast to increase between 2016 and 2030 by 30%. in each of those cities. So it's taken 200 and something years to get to where we are now. And in the space of those 15 years, another third or nearly. Now, the sort of cities we like to compare ourselves with globally, none of them are growing at that speed. None of them. Paris, London, New York, Los Angeles. In fact, Los Angeles has shrunk, but Paris, London, New York, they're only at between 5 and 10% in that same period. Shanghai and Beijing are nearly as fast growing as Australian cities, and they do things very differently in that country, as we know. So it's the speed of growth that I think is testing us, and we're simply not keeping up. And when that happens, people notice it, and it translates into a falling standard of living, and that's something I think we've just got to be very careful about.
I guess it's showing in lots of ways, but if we listen to our politicians, they're telling us they're investing records amount in infrastructure and in regional development as part of a plan for a stronger and brighter future.
They do say that. To an extent, they're right. I think the other thing we've been wrong about is that we've perhaps over-invested in inner cities, even prior to COVID. Some of the fastest growing industries, being health and education in particular, were taking place in suburban areas, and we haven't really been investing in the infrastructure in suburban areas to the same extent as we have rewarded inner cities. And of course, there's a lot of outlying local government areas which have been tasked with being the big population soaks for the major metro areas. And while they've been tasked with the rapid population growth, they haven't been equally provided with infrastructure designed to attract jobs for people to work locally. So we've actually been building the wrong urban model, which presumes a concentration of jobs in the inner city and presumes that outlying areas will largely be dormitories where people will commute from. In fact, the economic reality is very different to that.
COVID's totally changed that. So now local neighbourhoods more important than ever, isn't it?
Yeah, it has. Well, I think what COVID has done is shone a very bright light on something that was already happening, which was an increasing dispersal of our economy into suburban centres. COVID has come along and given a great big push. And, just look at the CBDs now. Companies are having to dangle all sorts of inducements to try and get people to come back to the office. And it's difficult to see how that's sustainable over the long term, either for the workers or for the employers. It's going to be a fascinating thing to watch.
So, first of all, you're suggesting that there hasn't been sufficient infrastructure development in the suburbs. What about regional Australia?
The same. It's absolutely the same. In fact, you look at some of the regional cities, there's Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, Victoria, you've got Orange, Tamworth, Casino maybe, Armidale, New South Wales, Toowoomba, Rockhampton. All of the regional cities across Australia suffer the same infrastructure deficit, in particular, that outer, middle and outer suburbs have suffered because they just haven't been seen as popular causes, I suppose, in the eyes of some politicians. And without that infrastructure, particularly the social infrastructure, quality health and quality education, it's very hard to get people to move there to take up jobs. And if that's hard, then it's very hard for employers and businesses to grow and prosper in those areas.
Well, when you're talking about infrastructure, I guess a lot of listeners are going to be thinking roads and, boy, the roads are more squashy today, and where are we going to put all those cars if another million people come into our cities over the next little while? But it's more than just roads. What other infrastructure are you talking about? Well,
you're certainly right about the roads. Every million people will result in another 600,000 to 700,000 more cars. That's just a mathematical formula. We don't seem to talk about how we're going to manage that. Every million people is going to require equivalent of 4 large public hospitals. It's going to require schools as well, which is something I've just brought up recently in an article looking at this, that a million people will generate demand for about 160,000 school-age students, or something like another 400 schools. And here's the problem. If our population and planning strategy is to look at infill, whereby we create more housing density in established urban areas, that population growth in infill locations is going to generate demand for schools in infill locations. Where are we going to find the sites? Because most infill areas are already built out, unless we start to think very differently about things.
Well, I'd like to look at the school situation in a moment, because I read your great blog that gave some interesting insights. But Currently, there's that population debate. Okay, we've closed our borders, people didn't come. And as you said, prior to that, we were growing faster than almost any other developed country in the world. So many Australians are wondering whether our proposed annual immigration intake, well, maybe it should be lowered. Maybe that would put less pressure on infrastructure. Maybe it would protect our jobs, would stop surging house prices. It's an ongoing debate, isn't it, Ross?
Well, it is. And just look what happened with COVID. The population growth stopped because the immigration tap was turned off and house prices have done very well. Thanks very much. We've had a full economy with low unemployment on nearly all of the economic indicators. Things are going extremely well without massive immigration growth. So there is, I think, a strong argument to be made that a more manageable pace of growth would actually deliver far wider benefits to a broader cross-section of the community, because otherwise you've simply got the likes of the Harry Triguboff saying, bring more people in, I'll just build more apartments and everything will be good. But he's not dealing with the shortages of hospital beds and ramping at public hospitals. He's not dealing with shortages of education places and massive congestion, and he's not commuting 2 or 3 hours from outside of the city to get to his work. So we are creating problems for ourselves, I think, with this massive rate of growth.
Now, let's just put it into context. About 25.5 million people in Australia at the moment. We thought we'd get to 30 million by 2030, and COVID's put a halt on that. But it may get to, 29 million now, people are suggesting. So that's still another 3.5 million people to fit in somewhere. And in general, they're going to move to our 3 big capital cities, aren't they, over the next 8-9 years?
Well, I think that's what the problem is, that if the growth was spread around the country more equitably, if the regional centres were more attractive to settle in because they offered similar urban amenity and similar standards of social infrastructure and hard infrastructure, then you'd be spreading the load. But pumping all of that population into mainly Melbourne and Sydney, and to a lesser extent Brisbane, that's what's causing the problem. It's those major cities that are growing too fast. I don't have a problem with a large Australia or a bigger Australia at all. But I think if we're going to pump a lot of people at a very rapid rate into primarily 3 cities only in a country the size of Australia, then I think we need our head read.
Well, the government's been trying to get them into regional Australia, into Adelaide, and sometimes their visas force them to stay there for a period of time. It just seems that once that forced period is over, they migrate back to where their communities are, where their culture is, where there are other people from their homeland. And I guess many of them have already come from big cities, because most of our population growth has really been from India and China, hasn't it?
Lately it has, yeah. And we've relied on international immigration since white man in this country, to be honest. Look, I think the challenge there is that, as I said before, if the regional cities offered, and if we'd invested in the regional cities to the same extent we'd invested in inner cities, you would find that they would have a relatively good quality, access to quality of schools, universities, hospitals, parks, cycleways, cultural facilities, all the stuff that inner cities and major capital cities takes for granted typically aren't apparent to the same degree in those regional cities. And perhaps that's why they haven't had the opportunity to grow organically. I think the idea that you just relocate a government department out to Orange or Tamworth or something and hope that that's going to solve something is a bit silly. It's taken the best part of 30 years. The Better Cities program in Australia is 30 years old last year. It's taken that long for the inner urban areas to turn themselves around, because 30 years ago they were not desirable. Now it's some of the most expensive real estate you can find because it's highly desirable. And that reflects, a long-term strategic approach to infrastructure and placemaking. If we took the same approach to some of our larger regional cities and outer suburban areas and created more opportunity for people to have a similar quality of life, I think you'd see the employment landscape move, but it doesn't happen instantly.
So are you suggesting that the gentrification of those inner suburbs, which used to be the industrial suburbs, that's where the factories were near the ports and near the CBDs, and that eventually changed and the migrants moved out of that and moved to the suburbs when freeways came and when the schools came. Are you suggesting that was a planned thing or did that just happen by chance?
Well, the Better Cities initiative was planned. It started 30 years ago in the Hawke-Keating era, which is going back a while now. But it looked at the problem of inner cities hollowing out, where jobs were leaving and where existing infrastructure, schools being one example, was being underutilised. So class sizes were shrinking and they were looking at the prospect of closing schools. So they realised that they needed to do something to prevent the hollowing out. And the Better Cities program basically created a direct connection to a number of local governments around the country. It was implemented in Perth, in Adelaide, in Melbourne, and Sydney, and quite spectacularly in Brisbane, where the rundown areas of New Farm, Tenerife, the Valley, which were hobo country and druggy country, let's face it, 30 years ago, they were back then, I think, around about 25 to 30 on the median price list of suburbs, and they're now number one. No, number one, most expensive in all of Queensland. So it's been a complete turnaround and it took a long time, and that was a very deliberate policy. So we've learnt so much from doing it in our inner cities. I don't understand why we aren't looking to do the same thing in suburban and regional areas where there used to be a lot more jobs, where factories that used to employ hundreds of people are now standing idle, or at best they're being used for storage. Well, it's time that we look at repurposing that land and finding new alternative uses, particularly, I think, around social infrastructure, schools and health, to give that land a new lease of life and to bring more quality facilities closer to where people already live.
Well, gentrification takes decades. It doesn't happen overnight. And we've gentrified those inner ring suburbs of our capital cities. So what's the next step? Is there any big picture plan about the next range of gentrification?
Yeah, I think you're going to see this happen by default, and perhaps not because of planning schemes, because planning schemes can often be a couple of decades behind what the market is trying to do. But I think you're going to start to see a lot of middle ring, former industrial areas that are simply no good for industry anymore. They will be converted to an alternative use. So trucks are B-doubles these days. They need large turning circles. They need access to major interstate or local highways and freeways. They don't get around in suburban streets in some of these old industrial areas where the trucks just used to be, quite small. So the industry's left. As I said, there's a lot of space that's now being underutilised, where the employment density is a fraction of what it used to be. It's fanciful to think that industry is going to return to those areas, but why can't we look at those areas being repurposed in the same way that many of our inner city areas featured industrial property that's been adaptively repurposed into completely different uses? And I think you've seen that happen in every capital city in Australia and also in a number of the regional cities. So if it can happen there, then why can't it happen in some of these suburban centres?
Good point. Now, Ross, you recently gave some great insights in the blog you've written about looming shortage of schools as our population growth. I'd like to explore that a little bit further, as this is going to be a significant driver for space, especially in our suburban centres. And it's also clearly going to be a driver of where people want to live, because in general, people want to send their children to good schools. So can we first start off with some big numbers? Put it in context for us, please.
Well, okay. So roughly 25 million Australians and roughly 4 million of us are school age. I think, as I mentioned, another million people in any particular city generates demand for another 160,000 students. An average school size of, say, 400. There's another 400 schools for each million of population. As I said, if that population growth is going to be in infill locations via higher density and established parts of the metropolitan fabric, then we're going to have to find spaces for schools in those areas. And that means something very different to the old model of a school with a bunch of low-density buildings and a sporting field or two for their exclusive use. We're going to need to look potentially readapting space in suburban shopping centres, perhaps some of the big box retailers that left, could become space for schools. They tend to be very well located near public transport, bus routes, lots of parking. They tick quite a lot of boxes. The same could happen, as I said, in industrial areas, and the same potentially could happen. I've got a strong view that around the transport network, train stations in particular, we've fallen into the trap of thinking that all that we need around train stations is high-density housing so that everyone can jump on the train and commute off to work. But that defies the reality that between 8 and 9 out of every 10 people actually live and work in a suburban area. So you're not going to ever have that many people wanting to commute to the CBD. Why can't the space around train stations be used for schools? Because a school with its own train station is a magnificent way of dealing with congestion, because mum or dad feel that they have to drive kids to schools these days, and because the public transport system is regarded as being inferior or the safety concerns. But if the station was more or less integrated with the school, then that's another thing altogether. So at the end of the day, Michael, we've got to think about what this growth is going to generate in terms of demand, particularly on social infrastructure like schools, and stop just having a one-dimensional debate about building enough houses, because it's also about building enough schools, about enough hospital beds, about enough road space, about building enough of everything that goes with it.
Otherwise, we're not going to be living in those fantastic cities that we're currently enjoying. But it's not just schools. The education sector is a major employer as well, isn't it, Ross?
It is. It's one of the fastest growing industries in the country, health and education, adding a lot to the economy. Education alone employs 1 in 10 of the entire national workforce. Most of the jobs growth is going to take place in the suburbs because that's where education tends to happen. It's not a centralised industry. Once again, that's going to put pressure on a lot of our suburban infrastructure. But if we plan ahead for it, that could actually realise a lot of opportunity, I think. But once again, it means bringing our planning schemes rapidly up to date and being prepared to do things very differently to the way they may have been done in the past. The other thing to keep in mind about schools is that we instantly, all of us, I think, picture the traditional school model, a large school, sporting fields, all the rest, but there's many schools that are much, much smaller, but fewer than 100 students in many cases. And that's because of particular faith-based, cultural, education needs, specialisations, whatever. Those schools do not need their own sporting oval or gymnasium or swimming pool. They simply need space for their children to learn and be supervised and mentored. And that can mean space in office buildings, in shopping centres, in converted industrial. It can mean space anywhere. But sadly, a lot of the planning regulations don't allow for that to happen yet.
Interesting. What's the mix between government schools and private independent schools, Ross?
Oh, well, most of the kids at this stage, I understand, go to government schools. The non-government or the independent school sector split between Catholic and the rest. But they are a large part of the market. And I think the other thing you're going to see is a lot of institutional money looking at the education sector, particularly non-government, in the same way that they've dived into private health in a very significant way, and in the same way that they've dived into tertiary education. Charter Hall, for example, partnering with University of Western Sydney to develop their new $400 million campus, I think it is. You're going to see similar things happen where the non-government school no longer needs to save up with chook raffles and tuck shop drives for 50 years to build up a capital fund to buy its next building or to expand its campus. Instead, they may partner with a financial institution who will fund and develop a new campus for them in exchange for a very long-term lease back.
Interesting. So that's the private, the non-government schools. Where the government's going to find the money, the funding, and the sites?
That's even more of a problem, I think, on the government side, because other than a few vertical schools that are starting to appear, I think the government schooling sector just seems to be particularly traditional. But it's just not going to be able to provide the number of places required. So you're already seeing, we've had it here in Brisbane, I don't know what it's like elsewhere in the country, but parents sleeping out overnight to get their children placed into the state school system if they're outside of the catchment. Right? So they've got a preference of where they'd like their children to go to school. If they're outside the catchment, they've got to make sure they're at the top of the out of catchment list and they're camping out outside of school. So that's a definite sign of a market shortage. It potentially also means a real estate opportunity if you start to think carefully about schools as a piece of infrastructure, which is going to be an increasing demand. Then you start to look carefully at a range of real estate opportunities in and around those schools because people will want to buy into that catchment.
Clearly, Ross, there are some school catchment zones that have strong demand and therefore command much, much higher rentals and property prices as well. In fact, I know that's one of the areas that we look at when we advise our clients at Metropole. If they can get into a good catchment zone, that's only going to, in the long term, keep increasing the value of their property. But it seems like as demand continues now, as we're going to have population growth, and there's no doubt that we are going to have population growth. Both sides of Parliament have agreed with that. It seems like they've forgotten about schools and other social infrastructure compared to the housing, which tends to get a lot of publicity. They made a bit of a mess of planning for housing. How can we avoid doing the same with schools and other social infrastructure, Ross?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? I mean, I don't know that we've learned our lesson on housing. We've done a terrible job of planning adequate housing. I don't agree with the focus on primarily 3 major cities to absorb a lot of this growth. I think that's going to cause more problems. I don't really agree with the introduction of the urban growth boundaries and the attempt to prevent so-called sprawl. There would be no problem with that to a degree, provided we manage the environmental consequences, if we didn't concentrate all the jobs in the inner cities, if we created a lot more job opportunities out in middle and outer suburban areas and in regional areas, and make them attractive to people and businesses. By making sure the right infrastructure is there, we'd probably be able to manage it. So we've stuffed up housing. We've now got some of the most expensive housing in the world as a multiple of incomes. That's come through priming the demand side and not adequately responding on the supply side, and also tying up the supply side in taxes and regulation and red tape and process. And it takes a hell of a long time now just to get permission to build a house, or it can do, which is crazy. So if we do the same in the schooling side, then I think it's inevitable there will be a shortage of schools. I think it's probably inevitable there'll be a shortage of hospital beds and hospital places. We're getting older. When you get older, you need more healthcare. You're seeing ramping issues. I don't think there'd be a state in Australia where the health system isn't under a massive amount of pressure. That reflects both the rate of growth in the population and the slow rate of growth in providing additional beds to keep up with it. So have we learned our lesson, Michael? I don't think we have, to be honest, but perhaps just like the last couple of 100 years, we'll continue to muddle through and hope for the best.
Well, you've opened up a whole can of worms, so I look forward to having you back again soon to talk about the town planning implications and how we are going to manage to fit another Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane into our Australian population before the middle of the century. That's going to be an interesting discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Now, Ross, if people want to find out more about you and follow your blogs, sure, we republish them on Property Update, but where can they find out about you?
The blog is called The Pulse, and I'm sure if they Google my name and The Pulse, they'll find it and they can sign up to it from there.
I will leave a link in the show notes to make it really easy for them, Ross. And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
In a moment, I'm going to share my popular mindset message with you, but I just want to follow on with my discussion with Ross. By the way, if you enjoyed my chat with Ross and you got some benefit from it, once you finish listening to the show, tell somebody else about the Michael Yardney podcast, somebody else who'd get some benefit from listening to what Ross had to say. But before we get onto my mindset moment, as I said a second ago, I just wanted to I guess, mention that there's lots happening out in the world at the moment. There's things happening with our economy and the world, which creates challenges for people interested in property investment, but it also creates opportunities in selected markets moving forward. But it's worth remembering that to be successful, you really need to focus on the whole story, not one chapter. So sure, there are severe geopolitical tensions overseas, and back home there's the spectre of rising interest rates and rising inflation. But if history's taught us anything, it's that the best investment opportunities are available when others sit on the sidelines just waiting for the story to unfold. So if you're still interested in property investment or buying a new home this year, this is a great time to get all your ducks in a row so you can get set and take advantage of the opportunities that abound as the picture becomes clearer. In fact, now's a great time to invest with a long-term focus. If you want to know what I mean and understand what your options are, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? By the way, we don't have any properties for sale, which means we can give you independent advice. We can tell you whether it's the right or not the right time for you to move forward at the moment. We can tell you how your current property portfolio is working. If you've got one, we can fix problems. We can look out for problems and prevent issues moving forward because we've seen the landmines, or we can help you get better rates of return using proven frameworks. So if you'd like to have my team at Metropole on your side to level the playing field, well, actually does more than level the playing field, it stacks the odds in your favour, go to metropole.com.au, find out about what we do, leave us your details, and I'd love to be part of your ongoing wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In today's Mindset Moment, I want to explain to you why you shouldn't worry about your failures. Look, we all get things wrong. We all make mistakes. But I want to explain to you a couple of reasons why failing is overrated. Now, I've failed in all sorts of ways in my life, in my personal life, in my business life, even in my investments over the years. But let me again remind you why failing is overrated. First of all, failure is never permanent. That sinking feeling that you've got, that'll never last forever. The best way to reflect on your failures is to focus on the lessons that you've learned and the persons you're going to become, rather than spending your time trying to avoid failure. The less time you spend on rejection, the faster you're going to grow. The second way you should think about failure differently is to own up to your failures. The moment you openly talk about the things that make you vulnerable, they no longer have power over you. People will appreciate your honesty because everyone knows what it's like when they've had setbacks, when they've made mistakes. They're going to respect you for owning up to your problems and embracing your failures. And in the process, you will become stronger. Now, another reason why failing is overrated is the world won't change unless you do. The world owes you nothing. It was here first. We can't blame the shortfalls in our lives or other people around us or past decisions that we've made for how things are in the present. It's not the events that define who you are. It's how you choose to react to them. So forget what others are saying. They're never going to judge you anyway. They don't really care as much about what you're doing or how you performed like you think. But you do have to realise that if you want the world to change, you're going to have to change your ways first. Now, this is a common theme that comes through my mindset moments, isn't it? So the next question really is, how badly do you want it? Whatever it is that hasn't worked out. As Steve Jobs once said, if you don't love it, you're going to fail. Look, we've all heard about Thomas Edison, who had 1,000, or supposedly 1,000 unsuccessful attempts at inventing the light bulb. But from his perspective, I didn't fail 1,000 times. He's said to have said that the light bulb was just an invention that took 1,000 steps to get there. So I'd like you to remember that just because you failed, it doesn't mean you're a failure. Never let failure deteriorate your self-worth. Now, I know it's easy to say and it's hard to think about it that way, but if your head hurts, you say, I've got a headache. You don't say, I am a headache. So failure is nothing more than an event. It doesn't mean you're a failure, so don't personalise it. And it's really important to recognise that failure is part of the process. The fastest way to success is to double your failure rate. Successful people have failed more times than a beginner has ever tried. If you want to succeed, fail faster. I often say I'm a real success at failure, but that's okay because I get up one more time, and so should you. So don't worry about your failures. Thanks for spending the last half an hour listening to Ross Elliot and me talk about the challenges we're going to have moving forward. And if you got some benefit from this, and as I said a moment ago, if you know somebody else who you'd also think would benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. You'd be doing them a favour, and you'd be doing me a favour helping more people become financially fluent. And I've got a way of saying thank you to you. Whether you send on the message or not, just go to podcastbonus.com.au, podcastbonus.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes, and you can get a heap of reports and ebooks, my way of saying thank you for subscribing to this podcast. I'll be back again real soon. You can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney, or go to our private Facebook group, look for the Property Update private Facebook group, and each day I'll leave you some little tips, some charts, something informational. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?